when we zoom out and look over longer time scales, plant-based, omnivorous, we see pretty similar gains as long as protein intake is high enough in both groups. And so the things we really care about, the things I really cared about, were strength, building muscle. And for too long, I thought that a plant-based diet would be prohibitive in those areas, and it turns out not to be the case.
Hey everyone, this is Ryan from Ethics Fitness, and you are listening to Season 2 of the Ethics Approach podcast, the podcast where we highlight inspirational vegan athletes and what they do to absolutely kill it on a plant-based diet. If you haven't already, it would really help out if you subscribed to, liked, commented, and or shared any of the content I'm producing, including this podcast, ethics coaching services, articles and training programs available on ethicsfitness.com, videos on YouTube, and more. Links for those will be in the description, and I truly appreciate everyone listening for all of the continued love and support. In this episode, I'm joined by the one and only Dr. Eric Trexler. Eric has a PhD in human movement science, earned his pro card as a natural bodybuilder, has been a coach since 2009, and is currently a metabolism researcher at Duke University in North Carolina. Eric is also co-owner of the Mass Research Review, which, if you didn't know, is a monthly newsletter that breaks down the most recent nutrition and exercise-related research into easy-to-digest content. Eric has also published dozens of his own peer-reviewed research papers on exercise and sports nutrition, and is at the forefront of the evidence-based fitness community. I've personally been a follower of Eric's content for years, probably since around 2015, and have the utmost respect for the unbiased, high-quality information he puts out, which is why I was very excited to find out that Eric went vegan for ethical purposes in 2020 during his studies into Buddhism and spirituality. Eric and I delve into why exactly he chose to follow a vegan diet, how his experience has been so far, both personally and within the fitness industry, the research on plant versus animal protein, the health benefits of a plant-based diet, and general healthy diet practices, dietary nitrates, supplementation, and so much more. We packed a lot of great content into this episode, and I'm very excited to share with you all. Eric can be found on Instagram at Trexler Fitness, that's Trexler, and at TrexlerFitness.com. And I definitely recommend checking out the Mass Research Review at MassResearchReview.com. Thanks so much to Eric for taking the time to drop the knowledge bombs this episode, and without further ado, on with the show. All right, what's up, guys? This is Ryan with the Ethics Approach podcast, and today I am here with Eric Trexler. Eric, thanks so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Eric, do you want to do a really quick, almost like elevator pitch for who you are, what you do, really quick in a few sentences?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Eric. Been doing a lot of fitness coaching for the last, 15 years or so. Yeah. When was, 2013? How long ago was that? Oh, it's only 10 years.
Too long.
Oh, wait,
Feels
no,
like
I
it was
started in 2009. Started in 2009, yeah. Anyway.
2009.
Yeah, I've been coaching for close to 15 years now. Mostly, athletics, strength, powerlifting, bodybuilding. I competed as a pro bodybuilder. Haven't competed in a while, though. And did my PhD in, I mostly studied exercise, sports, nutrition. And so now I study metabolism and cardiometabolic health at Duke University. I've done a whole bunch of fitness-related research, and I also publish the Mass Research Review every single month, looking at different studies on exercise and nutrition.
Yeah, and Mass is awesome. For anyone who's interested in that, that's a really great research review. You were on the Stronger by Science podcast, obviously, for a super long time, which I've been listening to for, ever since I think it was like Strength Theory. I don't know if even the podcasts were around back then, but I was following since all the way back then. And you guys absolutely killed it with all that. And first of all, I want to say thank you so much for all the effort you put in with all that, dude. It's just incredible stuff.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. So just to kind of start things off, man, I'm interested in hearing a little bit about your personal history with everything here. So what got you into fitness and nutrition, everything in the first place, man?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've been coaching for almost half my life now.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy to think of it that way, but I got really into fitness when I was 12. I was playing football and I was not quite as big or fast as I wanted to be. And so I heard that lifting weights would help with both. So I started getting really into lifting, much younger than people typically do. And I just fell in love with it. So I was always like the one person in my friend group who was always thinking about what they were eating and, training like crazy, even as like a, 15-year-old, which was kind of funny. I'm sure a lot of people thought I was insane. So I just knew I wanted to do stuff in fitness, and I started coaching, and when I was 18 years old, just any coaching opportunity I could get. And I've just been staying as close to fitness as I could for as long as I could, and it turns out you can stick with it for a while. So I studied exercise science at Ohio State, then I did a master's and a PhD in exercise related fields at UNC Chapel Hill. Worked in the fitness, well, I still work in the fitness industry, but I was pretty much out of the academic world, had maybe half of a foot in it, but then recently had a cool opportunity come open at Duke University, and now I'm back in the research game, doing some really cool stuff with physical activity, energy expenditure, metabolism. So these questions that relate to fitness, they started occupying my mind when I was 12 years old, and they just haven't stopped. I keep thinking, once I'm no longer interested, and then I'll do something else, and I don't really see that happening.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I feel like fitness, bodybuilding, all that stuff, for a lot of us, we just get so into it just takes over everything. For better or worse.
Yeah, definitely.
So you also competed in bodybuilding, obviously, and you turned pro. What was that, like about 8 years ago or something?
It was 2017. So
okay.
How long ago would that
More
be?
recently. Oh man, I guess 6 years at this point.
Okay.
Dude, that's messed up. 2017 feels like it was like a month ago.
I know. Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, time flies. So, and you're not really pursuing bodybuilding anymore. You're kind of pursuing more of are you still doing marathon running and such, or?
Well, I've been dealing with some injuries that make it's a hip, so it's hard to lift
Yeah.
and it's hard to run, which sucks. So I've been working through that. While that hip issue is still ongoing, I'm mostly exercising for health and wellness at the moment.
Mhm.
I'm sure eventually I'll find some competitive endeavor to sink my teeth into, but I really like what I do for a living, which becomes its own kind of I really get into it the way that a lot of people with a competitive hobby might get into their bodybuilding or their powerlifting or their marathon running. So I am finding different ways to kind of scratch that itch without, the worst thing about my hip is not that it hurts when I'm exercising, it's that it'll feel fine when I'm exercising, and then I will wake up in the middle of the night with really bad pain. It's like a postural thing.
Ooh.
Once I lay down, it's just brutal. So I really don't like waking up with intense pain at 3 a.m. So yeah, and that's kind of getting between me and the running and powerlifting. And then when it comes to bodybuilding, that's an intense thing to do. And I always tell people, it's not that I've officially retired from bodybuilding, but I've always told people say well, is it time for me to compete yet? And I say, if I can't talk you out of it, then it's time. But if I can talk you out of it, then it's not. You have to be so adamant about being ready to compete, because it just takes too much. It's a really brutal process that no rational person could really go through. So you have to reach that level of irrational enthusiasm and then say, okay, clearly it's time.
Yeah, it goes back to the whole kind of being addicted to fitness sort of thing, just taking things to a whole new level and never stopping.
Yeah.
So that all sounds good, man. What are your to kind of shift a little bit here? I'm curious about your history with spirituality and getting into more of a vegan diet and lifestyle and such. Do you want to talk a little bit about what kind of got you into all that and how that's been going for you?
Yeah, definitely. So growing up, I was raised Catholic, and then my family was kind of just vaguely Christian for a while. And
Mm-hmm.
then I was living a life that was pretty just generally secular. I was, just doing other stuff. Didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about spirituality or religion or anything like that. I didn't like go off the rails and start living a supremely immoral life or anything. It just wasn't a big part of what I was doing. And then eventually, you live life. Got to a point where I was like, yeah, I had been hearing some things about secular Buddhism, and I was like, okay, that sounds like it's offering something that I might be able to use at this point in my life. I've always been a
Mm-hmm.
really intense guy. Like I said, the bodybuilding thing wasn't a fluke. I pick a thing, get really intense about it, and that kind of permeated into all aspects of life. And Buddhism offered this really interesting perspective that, you know, perhaps it was admirable to chill sometimes and not to be, a constantly going thunderstorm of ambition. It's just always trying to, strive for the next goal. Sometimes it's good to pause and kind of rest for its own sake. So anyway, I was hearing things about Buddhism that I liked. I like some of the ethical components. They kind of really resonated with me. And the more I heard, the more I kind of dug into it, the more I said, wow, yeah, this has a lot more to offer me than I even thought. So I started meeting up with a Sangha and practicing Buddhism with that group, specifically Zen Buddhism in the
Mm-hmm.
tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. Found a really great Sangha locally that practiced in that tradition, the Plum Village tradition. And so I used to always say, oh, I'm kind of getting into secular Buddhism. And now I just say Zen Buddhism. I don't really, sometimes people get debates about whether, you should call it secular or not. And I don't particularly care about the debate, not to disrespect any particular viewpoint or tradition, but, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh says, hey, here's our kind of Zen Buddhist tradition that we practice, and found a great group of folks to practice with. And, we get together, read some things, talk about some things, meditate. And yeah, so I got into Buddhism and really took a liking to it. And it was, from getting into that stuff. And by the way, it's as someone who grew up Christian and then, has really started to embrace elements of Zen Buddhism, it's, I haven't turned my back on on Christianity and said like, oh, what a terrible, sometimes people who change a religion or, spiritual tradition, they look back and say that last thing was absolutely terrible and I hated everything about it. That's why I, switched. Sometimes a bad experience precedes it. That's not really how I view it. I think that religion and spirituality have the potential to do a lot of good in small communities and in large communities and for the individual, And so right now I'm actually, the main project I'm working on is, believe it or not, in the religion and social change group over in the, I'm working with a lot of sociologists right now at Duke who really focus on religion and how it plays into society and even into health. So, yeah, the fact that I've taken a liking to Buddhism, it's just the right thing for me. It's good
Mm-hmm.
for me. But looking back at some of my experiences in the various Christian traditions in which I practiced,
Mm-hmm.
they had a lot to offer as well. And so anyway, that's an aside. But getting into Buddhism, some of the philosophical and ethical elements, I really they resonated with me, and in the Buddhist tradition where I did most of my reading, most of my practicing, it was standard to be vegetarian, if not vegan,
Mm-hmm.
just due to some of the Buddhist teachings about how sacred life is, and not just human life. And so that's one of those things where it's really challenged. I would talk about this on podcasts previously that I hosted, and it's always tricky because when you say I made a decision based on ethics, sometimes people make a leap and say, well, I have made that decision, so you're calling me an unethical person. And that's
100%.
of course not the case. Some of the, people in my life that mean the most to me, that I love more than anything, that I think of as just categorically wonderful people, they eat meat. We have different viewpoints on, the ethics of that particular question, but they're not unethical people. And so, yeah, for me, I enjoy the opportunity when I sit down for a meal to kind of feel like this meal was something, I could have made a variety of choices, but the choices I made at this meal, perhaps were better for the environment, perhaps made some small reduction in suffering on the planet. Those are things that make me feel good. And so, people have asked me, do you miss eating this? Or do you miss eating that? And in my experience was when you kind of transition to a plant-based diet for ethical reasons, that really doesn't enter into the thought process that much because you're doing it at your own volition. You're doing it because you literally want to, not because you're like, oh, I'd really prefer to do that, but instead I'll reluctantly do this, So yeah, that was kind of my path to a plant-based diet.
Yeah. I can definitely relate to a lot of those things, a lot of your viewpoints there. I definitely feel like it's like kind of, it's a personal thing to a large extent where it's like, this is what makes you feel good morally, and environmentally, like you also mentioned. I think that's a really important aspect for me also, where it's like, that's very much my beliefs. And I feel like if I didn't follow it at this point, I'd be very discontent with myself. Whereas a lot of people, they don't view the world that way, and they're not there. Maybe they don't ever care to be there, which is also like, I don't personally view it that way, but I would also never shove it in their throats in real life. Like I like to talk about it a lot on social media, but that's because like that's my sort of niche and like my outlet, I guess. But I very much agree with you there, man. So to keep moving forward on that, what were your expectations when you were first going plant-based? Did you buy into any myths or anything at the time, or because you've been very informed with your diet and you've been on point with your nutrition for so long, you didn't really think too much of it?
If anything, I would say I didn't really buy into any myths when I made that transition. If anything, I think there were myths that held me back from making that transition. I probably would have made it a little bit earlier if not for a few pretty pervasive myths. And, to be honest, the research wasn't quite there yet, so if you would, the main myth is it's really hard to build muscle on a plant-based diet because you have all these low quality proteins, which means you need to eat more protein to make up for that, but all the protein sources have carbs or fat in them, and so now your calories go way up. It kind of, I would buy into that whole kind of pathway of logic. But, there were a few studies that came out within the last couple years, pretty recently, showing that, as long as you're getting, a moderately high protein intake, a lot of those differences in protein quality don't really seem to matter when it comes to actual outcomes we care about. So you might find a study looking at, protein synthesis rates measured over 24 hours, but no one actually cares about protein synthesis rates measured over 24 hours. They care about, in 12 weeks, are my biceps bigger than they are today, right? And so when we zoom out over longer time scales, because a lot of things can influence short-term muscle protein synthesis measurements. When we zoom out and look over longer time scales, plant-based, omnivorous, we see pretty similar gains as long as protein intake is high enough in both groups. And so the things we really care about, the things I really cared about, were strength, building muscle. And for too long, I thought that a plant-based diet would be prohibitive in those areas, and it turns out not to be the case. And I will give myself a pass for buying into those myths because we just didn't have the data to refute them in a very confident way until shockingly recently. I'm kind of surprised it took that long, but here we are.
When did you go plant-based originally?
I got to be honest. So, as you could probably tell, I started this interview searching for dates and trying to crunch numbers of when things happened. I have
Yeah.
no idea. And the reason I have no idea was because one of the things that kind of got me to finally sink my teeth into Buddhism was being cooped up during COVID lockdowns. And I was like,
Gotcha.
I'm really unhappy without all these trivial things that I do to keep myself busy. It seems like
Uh-huh.
perhaps I'm attached to a lot of external factors that seem to be dictating whether or not I have stuff to do and I can be
Mm-hmm.
content throughout the day. And so that was something that really kind of got me into it. So early in COVID was when I really dove into it and made the switch. But
Mm-hmm.
I can't put it early COVID, time didn't exist,
No, it
like
did
I was
not.
cooped up forever. So I don't know exactly, but that's the general time frame.
Okay. Yeah, I went vegan back in about February 2016, I think, and that was when there was no studies at all.
Yeah.
There was a few guys doing it who were, competing in bodybuilding at a very non-competitive level, I would say. And there is a few guys on social media who were pretty big and saying they were doing it, but for me, I very much got into it at first from watching like Forks Over Knives, like very much more of like the health purposes of like lowering cholesterol, trying to reduce heart disease risk and such. So I was pretty into that back then, and then I quickly got much more into the moral and environmental aspects of it. But I remember going vegan back then. I was vegetarian for a little bit, and I was so ready to be like, yeah, I'm going to give up all my gains, man. My numbers are all going to go down. I'm never going to be able to compete in powerlifting at a decent, a respectable number, which I still can't. But, like I'm never going to be able to build muscle. And then, I tried it as like an experiment. And then, I started running Bulgarian, or not Bulgarian, Smolov back then. So just throwing volume at myself. And lo and behold, something was working and my numbers still were going up. So I was like, you know what, this is good enough for me. I'm just going to keep doing this. And then I never really put that, you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I feel like a lot of people, they think that it's like an obligation and that you're going to miss like eating certain foods and you don't have a choice really. But for me, it was very much like, I'm going to try this out as an experiment and see how it goes. Never felt like pressured into it, and then kept seeing the progress coming. So I guess I can relate there in another way where I just never felt like, that pressure, which I feel like you were kind of insinuating a little bit earlier, maybe.
Yeah, it's just, I never felt like I was kind of playing tug of war with those decisions in my head because the decision was, it was a high priority. It was something I really
Mm-hmm.
felt strongly about. And so in that case, when you feel really, really strongly about going left, you don't really think too much about the temptation to go right. It's because you're just
Exactly.
like, no, I want to go left, and that's what I've
Mm-hmm.
decided, and I'm very, very confident in that. So yeah, sitting down to a meal, there was really nothing pulling me away from these plant-based meals. And I tell you what, you're talking about your powerlifting numbers. Your biggest mistake with powerlifting is that you started in the wrong time, because back in 2012 when I was competing in powerlifting, there were
Mm-hmm.
some very average lifters who were the cream of the crop back then.
Oh yeah,
People
man.
have
500-pound deadlift back then was like,
Yeah.
you're super strong.
People have just gotten too strong. That's the real issue with the sport from my perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree there. There's actually this one guy I follow who's been vegan for years, and he just pulled like 805 or something in competition in like 181 weight class. Like, what is that? It's
Yeah.
insane.
And the squats as well in the 181 weight class and even the 165, they're just looking. It doesn't make any sense. It's not right.
I mean, obviously it's the pool there has just grown so much. So that's
Yeah.
that is a good point. It's just 2012 and such would have been a lot better. Would have made me feel a lot better
Oh, yeah.
mentally. So I wanted to get into some of maybe your research and such with plant-based diets, because I'm sure you've dug into it a lot over the past several years, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So, what would you say if are there any inherent advantages or disadvantages of a strict plant-based diet that you've come across in any of the literature or anything? Like in
Um,
regards to performance or health span, either one there.
yeah. So I guess let's start with health. And I find myself in a position when I talk about this, some plant-based dieters get angry with me, and some meat eaters get mad at me.
Oh, of course.
Which makes me think perhaps I'm in the sweet spot of just having everyone mad at me. So the yeah, I view a plant-based diet as being one of a few extremely, extremely viable diets that are compatible with, I don't like to say optimal health, but essentially close to optimal health, right? So
Hmm.
I like to talk about diets being compatible with health, just because there's a lot of different ways to eat, and there's a lot of different ways to be healthy. I think
Hmm.
when you start striving for literal optimal health, you're it's like, you get so wrapped up in trying to optimize every little bit of your health that you can't even enjoy your good health. And at that
Hmm.
point, you're like, what are we doing here? What's the point of, living this very healthy, miserable existence? So I don't like to get too into optimizing, but, for example, the US government, when they talk about three diets where they say, if you want to do the most you can to kind of prioritize your health and eat a well-rounded diet, there's three that they put forward. And I agree with their assessment of the literature. I'm not just saying, oh, because the government says so, because that's not really my perspective in life. I don't have blind trust of government entities by any means, but
Rightfully so.
my view of the literature is compatible with theirs, which is that there's great data on a Mediterranean diet. There's
Hmm.
great data on the DASH diet, which is built for hypertension, but it's just a really nice, well-rounded diet. And
Hmm.
of course, plant-based diets. There's really good evidence pertaining to health and longevity. Those are the three diets that tend to get put forward as, like, if you want to get really serious about your health and do everything you can, here's the three that seem to be really, really solid. And so sometimes plant-based dieters get upset because Mediterranean and DASH diet are not inherently vegan by any
Hmm.
means. Certainly not the Mediterranean diet. Um, and some people will say, oh, you have kind of a low fat bias, but that's not the case. A lot of Mediterranean diets are up around 40% of energy from fat. So, I mean, that's
Hmm.
a substantial amount of fat, sometimes even a little higher than 40. So yeah, sometimes plant-based dieters get upset with me for that. And then sometimes meat eaters get upset about putting plant-based diets in that category because they say, oh no, you're missing out on this and that and the other. You're going to waste away. You won't have any muscle mass. We've already kind of addressed that myth
Hmm.
and why it's not particularly relevant. But so benefits with a plant-based diet, I think, it's one of a few that are about as good as you can do in terms of, when we look at this broad spectrum of potential disease states and medical conditions that we might experience, um, you know, it's hard to do considerably better than a plant-based diet. I think if
Hmm.
you're doing a DASH type eating pattern, Mediterranean type, or a plant-based type, you're really putting yourself in a good position for health and longevity. Um, Now, having said that, there are potentially some, I wouldn't say downsides, but there are some challenges with a plant-based diet, right? I mean, anytime you're removing food groups, you are presenting new challenges to building your diet. So we have to get a little bit more creative with protein. There's no question about that. But
Hmm.
it's never been better to be on a plant-based diet. I mean, when you look at the options that are available now for plant-based
Hmm.
dieting, the protein shakes, have a vegan protein shake from 2004. It's not pretty, right? But having one now, it's a delight.
It's
Um, you know,
delicious.
I know some people in the plant-based community aren't really into the meat substitutes, because they're like, some people just don't, they're like develop an aversion to anything that's even reminiscent of meat.
Hmm.
Um, but if you're someone who's like, I'd love to go plant-based, but man, do I love a good cheeseburger. I mean, it's never been easier to be on a plant-based diet, but there are more limited options with protein. You have to think a little bit more about where your protein's coming from.
Hmm.
Um, it's harder to get away with a very low protein diet. So,
Hmm.
uh, you know, like I said, plant-based diets and omnivorous diets for building muscle, for, strength, performance, things like that, as long as your protein's high enough, they're equivalent. But if we're comparing two diets with inadequate protein intake, and then one is plant-based, one isn't, that's where the efficiency of animal-based protein sources actually does become an advantage. But my counter to that is eat enough protein, right? Like it's super easy to get around that. It's something that is a legitimate consideration. Another downside. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I quickly ask to build off that? Where would you say the cutoff limit would be in terms of like threshold for building muscle? Whereas like, plant-based diet might be too low in a certain amount of protein versus animal.
That's a good question. The what we can say for sure based on like, here's a study. Well, as sure as you can be from research, right? So sometimes findings come out and you try to replicate, doesn't work, right? So we don't want to go too crazy with one study, but it appears based on the literature, if you have 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, those diets seem to be equivalent, omnivorous and plant-based. So we know that the threshold is no higher than that. Could it be a little lower? Perhaps. Is it going to be all the way down at 0.8? No. And probably not even at like 1.0, so you want to be up in that 1.3, 1.4. If you want to be better safe than sorry, 1.6 grams per kilogram. So, yeah. Which is still,
it's pretty low, honestly. It's pretty easy to attain, I would say.
It's not particularly hard, no. And of course, that doesn't, now, if you're someone who has a relatively high body fat percentage, you might say, well, that is a lot, right? Based on your body weight. But protein needs aren't really going to scale up with fat mass. And so what that means is you're probably better off scaling to fat-free mass. And I think the last time I ran the numbers, I think I usually recommend 2 grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass. And so that would be something that's, you kind of have to guess your body fat to figure out your fat-free mass. But that scales better for people with extremely low or extremely, I don't want to use that. It sounds too, that's not very nice. But people who have well below average or well above average body fat levels, extreme is such a heavy word. But, that's when you'd want to make sure you're scaling by fat-free mass to make sure that you're not, because there's no reason that you'd want to scale that way upward to account for body fat. It's not really impacting your protein needs. So now a couple other kind of potential shortcomings. I think plant-based diets are great, right? So I don't spend too much time belaboring the benefits. Like I said, from a performance, muscle building, health perspective, it's hard to do much better as long as your protein intake is high enough. But some potential downsides that I like to kind of use to extend an olive branch to the omnivores and kind of say, hey, I'm not being super biased here. If you're not looking for protein, like if you're just if we just look at two people who are not really thinking about what they eat, an omnivore is probably eating more protein than a vegetarian, right? So that's something to keep in mind, is that if we're not intentional about our protein intake, a plant-based diet will tend to be lower in protein. But again, that's an easy fix. And then I'd say the final thing comes down to micronutrients, right? So with a plant-based diet, there are a few micronutrients that you just have to be a little bit extra mindful about getting, either because it's hard to find on a plant-based diet or because the bioavailability in plant-based products is just lower than it is in animal-based products. So for example, hard to find B12. A lot of folks on vegan diets supplement with B12. That's a very good idea. Or a basic multivitamin with B12 in it. That's my personal approach. I just take a multivitamin, I'm good to go. Another thing, and same thing goes, you don't really need fish oil, because if you're getting, ALA from plant-based sources, you'll make EPA and DHA. But if you want, you can supplement with some algae oil. That's just kind of an aside there. Another example, so, B12, you're just not going to find it, so you need to get it elsewhere, right? Calcium that's a tricky one because people will say, well, I'm eating all this spinach. Look at all this calcium, right? But the bioavailability is considerably lower versus something like cow's milk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, there are some micronutrients where you have to be really mindful of where you're getting them from, and you kind of have to eat more than you otherwise would, just because
Mm-hmm.
instead of getting all of it, you're getting a smaller percentage of it that's actually really getting absorbed and put to use. So those are legitimate criticisms, but I do find it a bit humorous that we've got this diet that looks great for health metrics, looks great for fitness related metrics, as good or better across so many different categories. And sometimes people will bring up these potential challenges as if they're these insurmountable challenges. And it's so funny to me because in most cases you can get around it with a protein shake and a multivitamin. And
Yeah.
there's other ways to get around it too if you don't want to do that. But in most cases, you can get around it with a protein shake and a multivitamin. And most of the
Mm-hmm.
fitness enthusiasts who I interact with who are, criticizing these diets, they're on an omnivorous diet, but they're already using a protein shake
Yeah.
and a multivitamin every day. And I'm like, dude,
Yep.
you would experience like no downside other than, um,
Yeah.
potentially having to alter your food preferences and miss out on some meals that you currently enjoy.
Yeah. I thought you were going to mention, I think it's like the anti-nutrients or oxalates or something, like they're just basically cooked out of a lot of foods that they're even possibly any sort of a concern. It's
Yeah.
something like that, isn't it? Yeah.
So
It's,
yeah, they're yeah. I mean, they have the potential to play a role in some of those bioavailability concerns, but
yeah.
it's just not that big of a deal. Most of the time, the way that you're cooking and processing greatly diminishes the role of those potential anti-nutrients. So yeah, it's theoretically a concern, but practically not a concern.
Sure, sure, that
Yeah.
makes sense. One question I had about what you were just touching on, do you think the benefits of a Mediterranean or DASH diet comes down to more of the increased vegetable, fruit, legume intake, or do you think it's because of just less meat? Like if you had to pick between one or the other, or do you think it's both?
Yeah, I think looking at the broad dietary patterns, which is like how I like to do it. Like, if I'm working with a client, I'm never going to just give them a handout and say, here's a Mediterranean diet. I hope you like red wine and olives, right? I think more about like what are the broader eating patterns that make up this dietary pattern.
Sure.
And when you look at all three of these diets, plenty of fiber, plenty of fruit and vegetables, plenty of micronutrients, not a ton of really fatty meats. Meat, there's some meat sources, they tend to be fairly lean, they tend to be eaten in moderation. Fat is usually coming from plant-based sources, the majority of it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at those eating patterns, they kind of share those commonalities. And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, and this is another thing that sometimes I get yelled at for on the internet. I wouldn't say that like simply by avoiding animal-based protein sources, you are making yourself dramatically healthier. I struggle to get on board with that because when I look at the longitudinal data and I look at the epidemiological data, it's hard for me to frame lean poultry as something that's negatively impacting health outcomes. It's hard for me to frame fish as something that's negatively impacting health outcomes. So I don't necessarily think it is purely the avoidance of meat, but I do think if you are on a vegetarian diet and avoiding meat and you're being mindful of your nutrition, you're likely to kind of by default fall into some of these healthier eating patterns that involve, plenty of fiber, fruits, vegetables, micronutrients. So I think it's one of those things where for a lot of folks, especially on Western diets, if you do say, I'm going to cut out meat, there's a decent likelihood that you're cutting out some of these, you might curb your total energy intake when you make that switch. Not necessarily, but you may. And you may find yourself in a situation where you're kind of cutting out some of these foods that, with these food combinations, maybe you end up in a situation where you have less highly refined, highly processed grain products. Perhaps you're certainly going to have less fatty meat. You're kind of just moving toward an eating pattern where you see an empty plate and you say, what am I going to put on this thing? And the things that you're likely to reach for, if you're going to actually put together a plate that has some substance to it, you're probably going to grab some beans and legumes. You're probably going to grab some fibrous vegetables to give some bulk to these meals. And most likely you're going to end up with a pretty nice eating pattern. But there's always that caveat. Like, you'll see someone who this was a big thing. I don't want to take jabs at them, but there were a few people, not throwing everyone under the bus, a few people in like the carnivore or like keto dieting community that would say, I did everything right. I was eating the high carb vegetarian diet and I felt sick and terrible. And then I switched over to carnivore and I feel like a new person. And you go,
yeah.
So and they always say, I was following the government guidelines and I was doing vegetarian. You say, okay, what were you eating? And it's like, I was eating Twizzlers and crackers, and like that was my diet. And it's like, you weren't following the government guidelines. You were just eating candy and highly refined grain products, which are fine in moderation, but like that's not the base of your diet, So I've seen so many folks who are like, how I know that carbs and vegetarian diets are bad is because you can't live off of Twizzlers and chips. And it's like, well, you could have maybe put together a better vegetarian diet,
Yeah, you would just think that's common sense, but surprisingly, the internet, it always comes through, Yeah. So I've seen too many of those posts, but it's all, the thing that always kills me is like, man, the government lied to us. I was doing everything right, and it's like, no, a third of your diet was a fat-free candy. Like Twizzlers should not be. No one in the government told you that you should just be eating that, Yeah. But anyway, I always get a kick out of that. Big Twizzler is sponsoring the government.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're subsidizing everything. So to close out on that, what about in terms of performance? Any advantages or disadvantages that you could think of there with the plant-based diet?
No, I mean, I think if I have, I think the easiest way to answer this is I have two hypothetical clients that come to me, and they're high performance athletes. One says I'm an omnivore. The other says, bad news, I'm a vegan. We're going to have to work around that. That doesn't tell me anything about how we're going to do. I can design a perfectly suitable diet for both of those individuals, no problem. The person who has animal-based products, they're not going to drag them down and impair their performance. But I can make a vegan diet that's just as suitable for performance purposes. So it really, in my opinion, it really just comes down to the more pertinent elements of the diet. Are you fueling your activity with the right energy intake, the right macronutrients? Are you able to perform and recover because you have your micronutrient needs met? One thing that I would look at for specifically a vegan female endurance athlete, I would look at iron. That's something I would keep an eye on. It's something to keep an eye on for all female endurance athletes for sure. But I might keep an extra eye on it if you're on a vegan diet. Make sure that iron levels are looking okay, that we're not seeing any early signs of iron deficiency anemia or something like that. But when I look at it, I think one of the nice things about a plant-based diet is you're probably eating enough carbohydrate to fuel your performance. You're probably, eating plenty of micronutrients from all the fruits and vegetables and grain products that you're consuming. You're probably putting yourself in a great position to recover. And then there's all the phytochemicals, that are not necessarily a vitamin or a mineral, but things like dietary nitrate that are so abundant in plants, a variety of different vegetables specifically, and some fruits. But you're eating all, maybe you're eating, a bunch of citrulline from watermelon. We find all these phytochemicals that have these really positive, and antioxidants that are going to help out with recovery on a day-to-day basis. So a plant-based diet can put you in a really great position to perform well, recover well, and the two go hand in hand. But I can say the same thing about a well-designed omnivorous diet as well. I think the biggest thing, whether you're on a plant-based diet, omnivorous, is, fuel your performance effectively. Make sure you have all those things that I just mentioned. Whether or not there's meat in your diet, it's really not going to make or break your performance outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's more about like what you're putting in that's beneficial, and then having an overall healthy balance overall should really be fueling you. So those good things like, all the like you were saying, antioxidants and such in vegetables and fruit help with recovery potentially, and then things like the nitric oxide promoting things, and the fruits and vegetables also, I guess, would be beneficial maybe for blood flow, maybe for like an aerobic athlete or something.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and even, there's some interesting research that it goes beyond blood flow. So it seems, based on the most current research, that nitric oxide seems to be having a direct effect on muscle, like actual muscle contractility. It's a well-known, it has a well-known impact on the energy, or the energy cost and the oxygen cost of exercise. And so what we'll see is that people can do exercise more efficiently from an energetic perspective. So exercise efficiency, blood flow, those are great, but also there is some evidence of direct effects on muscle contractile function. And what's really cool about it, I felt so lucky. I did my dissertation looking at nitrate and beetroot juice and citrulline. But I was looking at these nitric oxide precursors, and nitrate was one that I thought was really fascinating. But I felt really lucky to be studying it because it was at a time when, some people I know, they're doing PhDs, they're doing dissertations, and it's on things that have just been studied to death. And it's I'm not being critical of their choice or their work, but when you're studying something where there's still groundbreaking things happening, where there still are legitimate paradigm shifts, it's just an exciting place to be. So during my dissertation, it was around the time that we found out, did you know that we store nitrate in muscle? We didn't know that. It's like, it was just so cool to be part of this kind of, and I wasn't like a pioneer in nitrate research, and the work I did didn't make a dent really, but it was cool to be at least in the periphery of this area where there were still like legitimate groundbreaking things that have been coming out in like within years of me doing my dissertation work. And it's where I find myself now. I'm at Duke working with, I'm in Herman Poncer's lab now, and we're studying, he wrote the book Burn that got pretty popular about how humans, animals, in general, can downregulate energy expenditure when we do a whole bunch of exercise, kind of a conservation mechanism, so we don't exercise ourselves to the point of starvation, basically. And that's another area I'm only working with him because it has fascinated me over the last 3 to 5 years. And we still get these papers that come out and we say, oh, wow, well, things are different, and it's kind of an aside, but it's just so fun to be part of any body of research where you can we're not going to find anything out about omega-3 fatty acids tomorrow that's going to blow our minds, right? We generally get the idea. There's still much to learn, but when you're early enough in an area where there's legitimate, just mind-blowing paradigm shifts on a fairly regular basis, that was a fun place to be. But all of that is to say, we can look at plant-based diets and say, okay, is there enough protein, enough vitamins, enough minerals? We can go through all the boring stuff. But what's so fascinating when you get into the nitty-gritty and the area where there's potentially benefits from any diet that's high in a lot of fruits and vegetables, whether or not there's any meat in it. One of the fascinating things is there are so many bioactive or physiologically active components of these plant-based foods that we really haven't sorted it all out yet. So like a good example is coffee. Coffee is not caffeine water. Coffee has caffeine in it. That's what we associate it with. But coffee has hundreds of potentially bioactive compounds that could meaningfully impact the body beyond just its water content and its caffeine content. And I think that's kind of the fascinating thing about nutrition, is that in nutrition science, it's so hard to get at the independent effect of each bioactive component, because how do you begin to isolate it in a systematic and meaningful way? And when you remove it from the matrix of the food, potentially you alter some of its bioactive properties. So it's a tough nut to crack. And that's why I do think it's valuable to zoom out and say, when someone does adhere to a plant-based diet for a while, or a DASH diet pattern with plenty of fruits and vegetables, or a Mediterranean diet pattern with all these wonderful foods that are components of it, what is the bigger picture? You know, what do we tend to see when we zoom out and let all of these different bioactive compounds within the food matrices where we find them? What is the net impact of adhering to some of these dietary patterns? And in some cases, you can make the argument that for some dietary patterns, the outcome is kind of more than the sum of its parts. You know, it doesn't necessarily always reduce down to just, you know, saturated fat, total calories, and one or two other things. So as a researcher and a practitioner, I like to leave room for a little bit of that magic of, hey, there's a lot of stuff in here that we haven't fully unraveled. And so for that reason, I think you just can't go wrong with a dietary pattern that has plenty of fruits and vegetables, because the more we learn, the better it gets.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing you were kind of touching on there that I didn't want to interrupt you, but I found it very fascinating that you were first of all doing all these studies on nitrates and such. But do you find that through your studies and everything that you've looked into, do you find that supplements like citrulline, malate, for example, do actually have a power output benefit? Because I know it's been pretty controversial lately. What's your opinion on like nitric oxide boosting supplements in isolation?
Yeah, I mean, I usually tell people there's a million good reasons to get plenty of nitrate in your diet. There's good evidence to suggest it could help with aerobic performance and strength and power performance. And, you know, some studies it works well, some studies it doesn't work quite as well. That's what you should expect with sampling error. You know, you wouldn't expect, I mean, there's plenty of studies on creatine showing it doesn't enhance strength-related outcomes, but broadly speaking, it does. So, you know, when it comes to nitrate, I usually tell people, get your nitrate from foods. Eat some vegetables. You're not going to regret having some get something green with leaves on it, you know, get some spinach, get some beets if you like them. I usually tell people with nitrate, the supplements on the market that are cost effective are very low quality, and the quality control just isn't there. It's hard to say exactly how much nitrate you're really getting from them, which defeats the purpose. So with nitrate, I say there is so much to gain from eating these high nitrate foods beyond their nitrate content, and they're probably a more reliable source of nitrate. So I think that nitrate supplements work, but the best one that I've seen is more than I'd personally be willing to pay for what you're getting from it. And it's the only brand that I think has really good quality control. And of course, you get what you pay for, right? And so for me, it's like, well, I'll just eat some vegetables instead. With citrulline malate, like you said, it is controversial. I published a meta-analysis on it in 2019, and the meta-analysis indicated there is a statistically significant benefit for strength and power outcomes, but it was just on the verge. You know, it was this kind of trivial, almost small effect size, and the p-value was just a touch under 0.05 for those who are kind of statistically inclined. And so even in the paper, I said, hey, this analysis says it works, but, you know, all it would take is like one or two studies, and this could totally flip to whatever extent you interpret p-values with that literal kind of cutoff, which I'm not a huge fan of. But all of that is to say, you think you're going to publish a meta-analysis and solve or resolve the debate. Not at all. It was still debatable after that. And my meta-analysis was replicated a couple years later, but it was still largely the same underlying data. It was a good meta-analysis, and it was different enough. I do think it should have been published. I'm not like saying, "No, I already did that." It was different enough to warrant publication. It was good work, but it was still the same general data underlying it. And we're still in that spot where with citrulline malate, you'll get a paper that comes out that says, "Hey, it worked," and another one says, "What do you mean? It didn't do anything." And so my view of it is it might work a little. It's not going to totally change your performance outcomes like a night and day difference. But when you look at citrulline malate as a supplement, the safety profile is excellent. It tends to be a very affordable supplement relative to others. The effective dose is not particularly expensive. It's definitely on the cheaper side, and it actually tastes good, which is rare for a pure powder. So citrulline malate powder, it's got this lovely citrusy sour kind of flavor to it naturally. And so if you get like a Mio like water enhancer that just makes your water sweet, any kind of sweet beverage with a little bit of sour, it's awesome. Like I would do like a blue raspberry water flavor with a little bit of sour. Oh, it was incredible. I actually have a friend who's a registered dietitian who would drink citrulline just because he liked it. He's even on days he wasn't going to be exercising. He's like, I'm not doing this for health or performance. I just think it makes my beverage taste better, and I prefer to have it than not have it. So all of that is to say, when I look at citrulline with a low risk profile, pretty affordable supplement, potential upside, good flavor, it's one of those things I say, if you're interested, throw it in there, see what you think. Not a terrible idea to consult with a doctor anytime you're going to make a change to supplementation, but for a healthy individual, the risk profile is quite low, and you're not going to spend an arm and a leg trying to try it out. So I think, if someone were to ask me, is there evidence to suggest that it works? Yes. Are you absolutely 100% certain that the true effect size is meaningfully greater than 0? That's debatable. But so far, there's enough reason to consider it a promising option.
Yeah. It's so funny you touched on the taste there, because I used to mix it with Gatorade, like, I don't know, pre or intra workout, and I mean, dude, it kicks it up to a whole other level, I feel like, because I just love that sour taste.
it's the only supplement that I can think of that will make your drink better.
Yeah.
And I've tried a lot of different powders. L-arginine, which is actually, a lot of people are like, oh, should I take arginine or citrulline? The answer is always citrulline, by the way. Arginine's not an effective supplement. But back in the day, before I knew that, when I was very, very young, I tried arginine. It was absolutely disgusting. And so, man, I'm so glad that it's not the inverse, because like it would be really a shame if citrulline was the one that worked and tasted like arginine, because that stuff is, whatever I was getting was unbearable. But yeah, all of that is to say, citrulline, plenty of reasons to consider it promising, but I wouldn't say, oh, it's just an absolute rock solid, surefire bet as a supplement.
So in terms of if you had to recommend any supplements for, let's just say specifically a vegan athlete here, a vegan lifter, we could do either one there, aerobic or anaerobic training, someone trying to progress on a vegan diet. What supplements would you recommend, either just for, if you had to recommend just a few, either for performance or for health? I know they're obviously different, but if you had to recommend just a few, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say what I take. Makes it pretty easy.
Sure.
I do consume protein shakes. Makes things a little easier. And you can have that as a shake, or I like to use PB2, the powdered peanut butter, and I will mix some chocolate protein powder with it into like a nice little pudding kind of consistency. Which leverages, my appetite's been kind of out of control lately. But food texture can actually make a big impact on eating rate and satiety. And I found that even though I'm eating the same number of calories and protein and all that stuff, if I eat a pudding kind of consistency instead of a shake, it actually kind of tides me over and keeps me fuller, which is pretty cool. Yeah. So I do some protein supplements. Every now and then I take algae oil. It's not critical, since, like I said, we can convert ALA to get EPA and DHA, but it never hurts to take a direct source of algae oil. Could be some modest benefits of directly supplementing with, a more substantial dose of those. And I take a multivitamin. And the reason I do that is, like I said, there are a few micronutrients that may or may not be lower in plant-based dieters. Things like iron, calcium, certainly vitamin B12, sometimes iron, sometimes iodine, depending on if you use iodized salt or not. So for me, it's like, well, I could go through one by one and, and there's nothing wrong with that, but to me, it's a little bit easier to say, if I take a well-formulated multivitamin, it's not like I'm going to experience toxicity if it's well-formulated, and it's just an easy catch-all to kind of cover all those bases. The only other things I'd really consider, or put a lot of thought into, and potentially recommend, creatine. Not a bad idea. Creatine's a pretty effective supplement if you're interested in, strength and power related outcomes, muscular endurance. For aerobic outcomes, probably not going to do a ton. I've seen some people talk about supplementing with creatine for brain related outcomes, and I think it's interesting in theory, but I also, based on the literature I've seen, it doesn't look like you meaningfully change brain creatine saturation unless you're taking like 25 grams a day. And so I do see a lot of lifters who are like, oh man, my memory's so much better because I'm taking 5 grams a day. And I'm like, maybe, but so far with the research I've seen makes that, it causes me to be quite skeptical. It seems like you need higher doses to really, and it makes sense, right? I mean, like, we cannot have low brain creatine. we cannot, if you have, if you're, unfortunately, if you're born with a deficiency of creatine in the brain, it's catastrophic. I mean, it's, really, really catastrophic. So it makes sense that our brain is going to do a pretty good job making sure we've got plenty of creatine around. So, but creatine can help out with some performance stuff. And hey, maybe there's a small benefit for the brain if you're taking the normal kind of 5-7 grams a day. Maybe. Why not? Another thing that's interesting is potentially beta-alanine. So I've seen some research indicating that vegetarians might have lower carnosine levels in their muscles. Oh, loud thunder. I don't know if you heard that. My chair.
No, I didn't hear it.
Yeah, we got some crazy weather today. I was almost late because there was a bunch of trees that were down on the roads. But anyway,
I'm in New York, so the loudest thing I'll be hearing here usually is just like some asshole blasting music off front,
Yeah. I've been to New York. I know what you're referring to for sure.
Exactly.
Anyway, what was I saying?
You're just talking about creatine.
Yeah.
Beta-alanine.
There's some mixed research. Some research indicates that muscle carnosine is lower in vegetarians than omnivores. Some research, it looks like it's not that big of a deal. Perhaps there's not a difference. So it really depends. But if you're someone who does a lot of middle endurance type stuff, frankly, the way I talk about carnosine is it's important for the stuff that kind of makes you feel like you're going to puke, right? So if you're doing 30-second all-out sprints repeatedly, if you're doing 400, 800, 1200, 1600 meter, those types of distances where you're just booking it and you're, exercise durations that are 30 seconds to maybe a few minutes in duration. If you're doing a lot of sprint work around there or repeated sprints, maybe you consider beta-alanine so that you can increase muscle carnosine levels. But that's really only if you're really serious about getting those last few percentage points out of your performance.
Sure. Would you say that creatine is a higher priority for someone who's vegetarian or vegan?
I would. The data for creatine, the research is just much stronger. Beta-alanine's been pretty hit or miss in the literature, and I wrote a position stand on it many years ago, and in the years since, the stuff that's come out, it hasn't totally changed the interpretation, but for a while there was a lot of people were hoping that beta alanine was going to be the next creatine.
Mm.
It works for a specific type of exercise, but it's no creatine.
Mm. In terms of like diet though, like I know a lot of people following like an omnivorous diet, they'll say like they're getting enough creatine through their diet, or they're getting more through maybe like red meat and such, whereas like a vegetarian vegan probably getting very little dietary creatine. So do you think it'd be a higher priority for that purpose?
Oh, so higher priority like vegan versus omnivore for
Yeah,
creatine?
exactly.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say so. There's some evidence to suggest that it's a little bit lower in vegans, but the thing is, omnivores benefit from creatine
Sure.
supplementation too. And so, vegan muscle creatine levels, last time I checked, I believe they tended to be a little bit lower, vegan
Okay.
muscle compared to carnivorous or the muscle of omnivores. But
Sure.
at the end of the day, like most people aren't really getting more than like a gram of dietary
In their
creatine.
diet.
Yeah, so um, it when you're talking about, hey, should I get 1 gram from my diet plus a few grams from a supplement versus just taking 1 more gram in supplement form? Yeah, if you're talking supplementation, everyone kind of stands to benefit to a fairly similar degree, in my opinion. Maybe it's slightly more important for vegetarians. So yeah, I
Sure.
mean, it's true, but at the end of the day, if an omnivore and a vegan are both supplementing with creatine, they're going to get to the same
Hmm.
place. But yeah, it's technically true that the vegan might have had lower creatine at baseline and therefore might have had just a slightly larger benefit.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we are closing in on, well, I think we're a little bit over an hour now. I want to be respectful of your time and just want to kind of close this out here. First of all, I want to ask you, do you think there's anything that we didn't get to touch on that you feel like we should hit real quick, or feel like pretty solid there?
No, I think one thing that I would mention, I would assume that a lot of folks who listen to your podcast are on plant-based diets, right?
Yes.
That
Yeah.
usually people self-select accordingly. I would encourage folks who are on plant-based diets to, uh, if possible, be a good ambassador for plant-based dieting. Make it more accessible, not less accessible. I think sometimes in
Hmm.
certain plant-based dieting communities, um, there becomes this competition where, well, if you're not quite plant-based enough, then it almost like backfires, right? So it's like there might be some people who are ready to cut out meat 3 days a week, right? And
Hmm.
I think a plant-based community that embraces that is one that grows and one that
100%.
is viewed more positively, broadly speaking. And so
For
if
sure.
someone says, "Oh, I'm doing meatless Monday," great, that's fantastic. And then someone
Yep.
says, "You know what? I'm gonna be a pescatarian. I need fish, but I'll let everything else go." Oh, that's fantastic. Really happy for you.
Hmm.
A
Hmm.
lot of people, some people seem to do it in stages, and if our reaction to someone saying, "Hey, I'm going to be pescatarian," if the first thing is, "How dare you," like, and you start going, and you might have excellent points about why you don't believe they should be eating fish, and they might be points that I agree with, right, from an ethical perspective. But um, I think the more that we make plant-based dieting accessible, the more that people obviously will embrace it, which
Hmm.
is ultimately a good thing from my perspective. So I'd love to see plant-based dieters become more interested in being ambassadors rather than doing a lot of really contentious purity testing about who is the most
Yep.
plant-based, right? So hopefully we can all do a better job in that regard, and everyone will be happy.
I'm completely with you there. As a collective whole, that's what matters the most. If we can get more people just eating a little bit less animal products, it's way better for the environment, saving a lot of animals' lives, and that's what I'm all about. So I'm completely with you there. Anyone taking a step forward, completely support that.
Yeah, it's like if
um,
someone says, "Hey, I started doing push-ups," and it's like, "Well, if you're not going to compete in bodybuilding, what are you doing here?" Right? And it's like, "Well, hey, give me
Get
some
out.
time." Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Very well said, man. I'm glad you brought that up because that's very much what I stand for too. It's very much like, celebrating the small wins people can make. I was vegetarian for 4 years, and I wanted to go vegan from the start, but I was in college and I felt like I didn't want to, I didn't have the money, things like that, and I didn't really have the knowledge. Life sometimes, it gets hard to prioritize certain things at certain points of life. So
Sure.
I completely understand that, and I completely agree with you there. So, all right, cool. Where can people find you, Eric, on social media and connect with you if they want to?
Yeah, I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is @Trexler Fitness.
Okay.
A lot of my work you can find more about what I'm doing at massresearchreview.com. We review a lot of exercise and nutrition research every month, and we actually are pretty. Like, I'm on a plant-based diet, and one of my 4 co-authors is also on a pretty plant-based diet as well. So we do tend to we tend to review stuff that's relevant to plant-based dieters pretty regularly, because we review the stuff that we think is cool and important, So those are the places to find me. And technically, TrexlerFitness.com does exist, but I really need to clean it up. So you could go there and be underwhelmed by it, but it exists.
Are you still doing coaching?
So not at the moment. I basically had some huge projects going on the last couple of years. I scaled my coaching down. I'm getting my research stuff going. Once I'm ready, I'm going to get back into coaching, because I do miss it, but I also need to spend time with my wife and stuff, so and take care of myself. So I don't quite have the available time yet to start that process of opening back up, but I probably will in the near future.
Awesome. Okay, cool. And that could be found on your website then, TrexlerFitness.com?
Yeah, absolutely. I do have
awesome.
a place where people can get on the waiting list for coaching, but yeah, if you try to apply, it won't let you because I can't put myself through that quite yet. I love coaching. I need to clear some projects off the plate because at the end of the day, an overworked coach, it's not good for the coach, and more importantly, it's not good for the client. If someone can't give you their all as a coach, you should be working with someone else. Yep.
Very well said. All right, Eric, I just want to say thank you again for taking the time to talk to us about all this. Super informative stuff, and hopefully see you again soon.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ethics Approach podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, it would mean a ton if you gave the podcast a follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Radio Public, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, Player FM, Pinecast, or any other service you're listening to it on, and if you subscribe to the Ethics Fitness YouTube channel, Instagram page, Twitter, and Facebook page. Feel free to check out the articles, training and nutrition programs, coaching services, and merch on ethicsfitness.com. And if you like what I'm making, dropping a like, commenting, and sharing would mean a ton to me. Thank you so much again, and I'll see you in the next episode. Peace out.